Hey guys, Mr. Ham here. I'm going to be talking today about China and India. So I want to give a little context on why we're talking about this. Um, we're kind of running right up into that time period in history where the world stops becoming segmented. Okay, and what I mean by that is we're not going to really look at what's happening in Europe anymore or what's happening in Africa anymore. We're going to be looking at what's happening to the world and kind of focus on different areas at different times. And so China and India become very relevant during this time period. And so it's important for us to get a little bit of background on kind of what's going on in China and India before this time period really happens. So that's what we're here to do is kind of look back and give you kind of a brief history of what's going on in China, what's going on in India, and kind of what makes these cultures distinct and kind of set them up for what's going on in the world stage. So, we'll start out with China. And to kind of understand China, you kind of have to understand the geographic impact of China and kind of what's going on in China at throughout history, really. China does have the largest population of any country in the world, and to kind of get there, we have to look at their geography. And the biggest factor in this are two rivers. So the two major rivers are the Yellow and the Yangtze rivers. The Yellow up in the north and the Yangtze in southern China, and they kind of run parallel in a weird way. I'll show you in a map here in a second to one another. Now, for much of Chinese history, China was isolated from the rest of Asia, and what I mean by that is isolated from most of southern and western Asia, not so much from Korea and Japan. We'll have a lot of interactions with Korea and Japan, but isolated from the rest of Asia. And the reason for that is most of it is very mountainous. China is, and then the other parts there's a lot of desert. So we'll look at a map again here in a second, but you'll see that it kind of creates a natural border around China that kind of isolates it from the rest of the world. And so what ends up happening is you have a lot of people kind of clustering in these small areas for their food. Okay, and I can see here 3.7 million square miles. It's bigger than the United States. So the square footage of China is bigger than the United States with a lot of diverse climates as well. So we can see a map of China here. So modern day China, if you follow my mouse here, kind of goes like this, up and around here, down through here, and it wraps around right here, down here through the bottom. And if you look at this map, you can really see this is all mountains. So this is the Tibetan Plateau here, mountains. These are all mountains here as well, kind of down throughout southern China. And then this is desert up here. Okay, this is the Gobi Desert. We have the Tibetan Plateau over here. Over here is really the areas that we're talking about being fertile for farmland. And this is the Yellow River here, and then you have the Yangtze down here as well. And we'll take a look at these here in a moment. But you can kind of see how it kind of creates a natural shield from, the Middle East and then eventually over into Europe and everything like that. And it kind of develops independently of all of those countries as well. Okay, so jumping way back in time, 1700 BC, 1750 BC, we have the Shang Dynasty. So when we talk about dynasties, you'll hear about this a lot in China. Um, it kind of talks about a family structure a little bit in charge of this. So you have the Shang Dynasty. So the Shang are kind of in charge of China at this time. And it's kind of a loose term here that we're going to use for the Shang because China isn't unified. There are societies, and they all have very similar cultures, speak the same language around this area, and they are ruled by an aristocracy. So when we talk about an aristocracy is basically a group of the rich, okay, the rich that have power. So if you have money in Shang China, you have power. And they are the second dynasty in Chinese history. We don't know too much about the Jie dynasty, but that's just because nothing was really written down during either of these dynasties. The only reason we know about the Shang dynasty is because it was written by the dynasty that came after it. So we'll talk about that and kind of what ended up happening to them. So the Shang were divided up into territories that were ruled by these rich warlords. Basically, they were the rich people that would have militaries and they would fight one another. So there isn't a unified China at this time. There are a bunch of little kind of mini countries, if you want to think of it that way, kind of divided up and dotted around China. Chinese culture at this time, they believed in supernatural forces that could help the rulers in worldly affairs. So basically, you pray to these supernatural forces out in the world, and they would bring good luck, good fortune to you based off of how you prayed and kind of what you did in your world. And a big, big part of this was ancestor worship. And so a lot of these families and a lot of these warlords and stuff like that would literally have shrines to their ancestors. So their grandparents, their great grandparents, going back down generations in their family, and they would worship them because the belief was that if you treat your spirits of your ancestors well, they would bring good fortune on your family. And vice versa, if you treated them poorly or you ignored them, then they would have bad fortune on your family. Bad things would happen to you if you ignored your ancestors. And so that became a major part of this culture, was this ancestor worship on behalf of these families. So, following up the Shang dynasty. Oh, sorry. First of all, here is a map of the Shang dynasty here. And so again, you can kind of see the Yellow River here, the Yangtze River here, and the Shang kind of existed right in the middle of that, right smack dab here in this small little area that they ruled. Okay. So, what followed the Shang? It is the Zhou dynasty. The Zhou dynasty. Anytime you see a ZH, it's a Z sound. Zhou dynasty. This is about 10,000 BC to 256 BC, so about 800 year span here almost. They are the longest lasting dynasty in Chinese history. Now, the Zhou are a little bit different. They claim that they are ruling China through the mandate of heaven. So the Shang, you didn't really have that, but the Zhou, you have this kind of belief they are ruling through the mandate of heaven. So the Zhou rulers stated that they are the link between the heaven and the earth. Okay, so they believe that essentially they are gods here on earth that are kind of representing heaven while they are on earth. Okay, so it kind of forms this link now in China between the rulers and kind of the divine. They are almost gods in this country because they are this ruling through this mandate of heaven. So during the Zhou dynasty, the concept of family becomes a major role. So there are rules that are literally written down about kind of your relationship, how you should always honor your elders, how the father is kind of the head of the household at this time. You know, honor thy neighbor and stuff like that, almost like these commandments that are put down about the relationship between family members and the roles that family members have. This is also a time when farming tools and practices led to a major population boom late in this era. So as many as 50 million people were living in China during this time. So if we are looking at our timeline here, 10,000 BC up to about 25.6 BC, or 256 BC, excuse me, we're running right up to the kind of Roman era. Okay, so we're looking at the early Roman era of Italy, and so think about kind of that timeline when you're thinking about that, about the Zhou dynasty. Now, the Zhou are probably best known for creating the Chinese written language. So the Chinese written language that is used today was created during the Zhou language. So it is one of the oldest languages that is still in use today. And the way they did this was through pictographs and ideographs. Now, pictographs are characters that represent an object. So literally think of it as almost like a drawing of an object. And an ideograph is a combo of two or more pictographs to represent an idea. So I want to show you an example here real quick. Up here at the top, we have the sun on the left here and the moon on the right. Now, if you squint a little bit, what this is representing, you can see here, is almost the horizon. So you can see kind of the horizon, the sun up here, the earth down here, and it is rising over it. And so this represents the sun. This is the modern day symbol of the sun, and you can kind of get a rough idea. Again, this isn't perfect by any means, but you get the sense here. And of course, the moon is closely related to the sun. It looks similar to the shape. It's got a little bit of extra legs here, but it's a similar shape to how you draw the sun. And so you can kind of see the link between those two, and it makes a little bit of literal sense as well. Shan here, you have mountain. Okay, so you can see kind of the peak here of the mountain. So again, it's an ideograph, or excuse me, a pictograph. It is literally a picture of this item. Now again, is it perfect? No, but it kind of shows this. Now we can move on to ideographs. Ideographs are really interesting. You can see over here, this is the symbol for man, this little line here, and this is the symbol for spear. Now, when you combine these two, symbol of man and the symbol of spear, you get the symbol for attack. So you combine man, you combine spear, and it kind of makes some literal sense, once again, that this would mean attack. So this is kind of the loose structure of the Chinese language, and it's still this way today. Now, it's much more complex, and there are hundreds of characters that make up the Chinese language. But you get a kind of a rough idea and rough understanding that if you understand the the character for man, and you understand the character for spear, you can combine those two, and we get attack. Okay. So this is the region of the Zhou dynasty. This is the land under the Zhou dynasty. So this is kind of later in that time period of the Zhou. But again, you can see it's kind of expanded from the Shang dynasty, but it's not near as big as modern day China. All right. Next up, we have the Qin dynasty. The Qin dynasty. So the Qin dynasty is kind of an interesting time period because prior to this, right at the tail end of the Zhou dynasty, you had this period known as the Warring States period. So you might have heard like the War of the Three Kingdoms, things like that in Chinese history. That's what's going on in China at this time. So you can kind of see this map here, and we have these three major powers in the Han right here in the middle: the Qin, the Wei, and the Chu. And they are all kind of fighting over China. They're kind of fighting for superiority in China at this time, and there isn't really a leading power at the time. The Qin, though, so this far western region here, gradually defeats their enemies, and in 221 BC, the Qin ruler claims a new dynasty has been created. So, who is this Qin ruler? Well, it is a guy named Qin Shi Huangdi, and he comes to the throne in 246 BC at the age of 13. Okay, young dude. First to use the title of emperor. So he's officially the first emperor of China. Now it's interesting because we had kings before with the Zhou and the Shang and stuff like that, but never a unified king that is calling himself emperor. Qin Shi Huangdi is the first one to do that. He is a phenomenal leader. He reduces the power of these aristocrats that have been running the country, and he does this by taking their land and splitting it up and giving it to the peasants. The problem here, though, is that he is an authoritarian, and his regime backfires on him. He gets executed by his own officials. He executes his own officials. He censors his speech. He has harsh taxes. All of this stuff kind of stacks up on Qin Shi Huangdi, and eventually he is poisoned by his own officials in 210 BC. Now, it's kind of an interesting story about what happens after he dies, because he's the first emperor of China, right? And he has such power that his advisors at the time really don't know what to do with him after he dies. Okay, so they're kind of terrified. They're a little bit scared about what he's going to do, or what they're going to do with his, reign. And so what they end up doing, though, is he is about 2 months away, about 2 months ride away from his capital. He's touring, and what they do at the time is they have these big kind of caravans where they have a bunch of little carts and stuff like that that travel along with the emperor. So what they did is they stuffed him in his caravan, they dressed him up, make it look like he's all right, and they closed all the windows to his caravan. Now, it's the middle of summer in China, so if you guys have ever smelt anything that is dead or rotting or anything like that, it stinks. Okay, and so you can't just cart this body around the countryside without air conditioning or anything like that, because it's going to start stinking after a while. So what do? Well, what they start doing is they start carting fish in big carts in front of and behind his carriage. And as they do this, these fish start rotting and stinking as well. And so people, when they're traveling through, assume that it's just these fish that stink, not the emperor's body in there. And so they kind of do this for 2 months while they travel him back, because he had such power that they didn't really know what to do after he dies. And so what eventually happens, they get back to the capital, and eventually that's when they announce that he had passed away, because they were so scared of being away from the capital and being away from the power without the emperor that they basically, cover up his death for a time period. So let's look at the Qin dynasty. Qin Shi Huangdi is a pretty impressive person because he's also one of the people that kind of started building of the Great Wall of China. So he's the first emperor. He starts building the Great Wall of China, and he is, one of the most powerful people in the world at this time period. And you can see this region that he controls is a pretty impressive region here of China as well. One more thing about Qin Shi Huangdi. So, in 1974, so about 50 years ago, there is a farmer in China. He is digging a hole for a well. So to dig a hole for a well, you have to dig straight down, looking for water for this well. And while he's digging, he discovers this statue of a soldier. And it's a life-size statue, and it's made of terracotta, which is like this ceramic material. If you guys have ever messed with like terracotta or seen it like on roofs or stuff like that, it's this ceramic kind of clay material that you cook, and it hardens and makes like this clay. So he finds this. He keeps digging and digging and digging. And eventually, what he finds are four pits. One of the widest is 230 meters long and 62 meters wide, so bigger than two football fields put together. And in these pits are 6,000 guards, horses, wooden chariots, all this kind of stuff is unearthed in this burial chamber. So they find out that this is the burial chamber of Qin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor of China, and he's buried with these 6,000 soldiers, guards, wooden chariots, all this kind of stuff he is buried with. And if you look at these aren't just like, printed out. These are each individually sculpted soldiers that are now guarding the emperor in the afterlife. So, really kind of interesting way to be buried, and this was discovered fairly recently. So it's a really interesting part of Chinese history. Okay, moving on from that. We are now into the Han Dynasty. The Han Dynasty follows the Qin Dynasty, and it lasts for about 400 years. Now, the Han Dynasty sits at a really interesting point in history. It is about 206 BC to 220 AD. Now, if we're thinking about this in relationship to the world, the Roman Empire is kind of at its height at this same time as well. But it's interesting because these two never really connected. They never really communicated. The Han Dynasty and the Roman Empire never had any sort of contact with one another. They're kind of existing in their own worlds at the time, even though they were two very powerful, some of the most powerful empires in history, existing at the same time, but never had contact. But the Han did start the Silk Road, and this kind of those first little inklings of contact between China, the Middle East, and Europe. They also established Confucianism. So Confucius lived during the Han Dynasty, and this is the primary source of philosophy and ethical guidelines. Following the Han Dynasty was China's Dark Ages. So just like in Europe, right around this time period are Dark Ages in China. And China was never fully unified at this time. The emperor's power was very tenuous, and it was very weak. One thing that did emerge, though, was Buddhism. Buddhism grew in popularity for centuries at this time. Following the Dark Ages was the Sui Dynasty. It was very short-lived, lasted about 30 years, but you saw the creation of the Great Canal and the Imperial Examination System. So the Imperial Examination System is, think of it as like the ancient ACT test. It only happens, though, once a year, and this test determines what job you're going to have, basically, in the world. Okay, so this is a very important test in ancient China at this time. I guess not so ancient China at this time, but it kind of determines your spot in the world. So it's a very, very important test. Following this is the Tang Dynasty. The Tang Dynasty. This is a golden age for poetry, painting, pottery. So it's not so much a military power at this time, but it's known for kind of Chinese culture being built around the Tang Dynasty. Following the Tang, we have the Song Dynasty. Song Dynasty is also relatively short-lived, only a few hundred years, but it is one of the most powerful dynasties at the time because of the inventions that it is known for. And we talked about this, so I don't want to spend a whole lot of time about this, but these four inventions all come up in the Song Dynasty. The compass, gunpowder, paper, printing, which of course would have a major impact on Europe and eventually a major impact on the world, and that all originated in the Song Dynasty. Okay, let's move on to the Yuan Dynasty. The Yuan Dynasty is also another pretty short-lived dynasty. It doesn't even last 100 years here, but it's really interesting. The Yuan Dynasty is known because it was the dynasty of Mongol rule. Now, the Mongols. Who are the Mongols? Well, we don't have a whole lot of time to talk about the Mongols, but Mongolia sits right on top of China. If you ever look at a map of China, Mongolia sitting right on top of it. Mongolia at this time was a powerhouse militarily. It was led by Genghis Khan. You've probably heard of Genghis Khan. He was the great Mongolian warlord that conquered huge parts of the world. So all of Mongolia. He conquered parts of the Middle East, so even as far as places like Iran. He conquers even parts of Eastern Europe, and he also sets his sights on China, though. China is kind of his goal. His ultimate goal is China. And after 60 years, the Mongols finally conquer China. And eventually, Kublai Khan, who is Genghis Khan's grandson, becomes the first Mongolian emperor of China. So, we now have the Mongols ruling China. So the Chinese are not in control of China at this time. The Mongols are. And excuse me, the Mongols are not kind to the Chinese. They segregated society in favor of fellow Mongols. Okay, so legally, socially, financially, native Chinese were forbidden from carrying weapons, meeting in public. They weren't allowed to do certain jobs. They had higher taxes. It was rough to be a native Chinese during this time period because you were treated as second class citizens in your own country. However, they did allow the Chinese to have freedom of religion, and also they encouraged the Chinese to have kind of theater and drama performances as well. The Yuan dynasty, like I said, it was relatively weak. It was unsuccessful in a lot of its conquests and everything like that, basically because it didn't have the backing of the population. Now, one thing it did do was kind of expose China to the rest of the world. So the Silk Road was in existence, but the Yuan dynasty are the ones that really took off with it. And they are the ones that really utilized it to make contact with the Middle East and make contact with especially Europe. And so the Yuan dynasty are kind of the first ones to kind of send those inklings out there. If you remember back to Marco Polo is greeted in China at the court of the Khan. Okay, so he comes here during the time of the Yuan dynasty. So again, if we look at our timeline here, this is kind of right at the tail end of the Italian Renaissance and of that era. Now, the Yuan dynasty kind of crumbles pretty quickly because of these political disputes. The Chinese just don't like it and they rebel, and of course, corruption causes the Mongols to collapse in the mid 1300s. So, this is the territory that the Yuan dynasty had, so a much, much bigger area than what we used to think about of like the Shang and Qin dynasties. Okay, we're going to leave there with China and move on to India. So, India. To understand Indian culture at this time, you really have to understand how these social classes in India work. So, early India organized its society into four different groups called Varnas. And these Varnas are classes or classification. So, these are social classes, and they were stratified, which means that there was a top class and there was a bottom. Okay, and it went top to bottom. So the very top were the Brahmins, and these are the priests. These were the Hindu priests. We'll talk about Hinduism in a second, but these are the Hindu priests, and they sat at the very top of the tippy top of this pyramid, and they were the very top. Right below them, and again, I apologize, I'm not great at Indian pronunciation. The Kshatriyas, they were the warriors and the administrators, and they were second, so they were very, very powerful because they were the ones that governed and protected. Next up, we have the Vaishyas. These are the artisans, landowners, merchants, and they were in third. So these were kind of the middle class, if you want to think of it that way. The ones doing a lot of like the business and stuff like that. And they support society through kind of creation of materials. And at the bottom, we have the Sudras. These are the ones that serve the other three classes. So the Sudras kind of assure stability and functioning. They do a lot of the manual labor, stuff like that. These are the Sudras. Now, we have these four classes, Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, and Sudras. There's kind of a fifth semi-class that is down at the bottom. So these are the Dalits, or called the Untouchables. Now, the Untouchables are, like I said, kind of in their own little world over here because they exist kind of outside of this class structure. And what they do is they basically do all of the jobs that are dirty jobs. Think about dirty jobs. Things like street sweepers, cleaning up human animal waste. They're the ones that deal with dead bodies. Okay? So these are kind of they're called the untouchables because they are people that belong kind of in this lowest class here, and they were excluded from kind of the system of the other ones. So it's kind of interesting because they are kind of their own little class, kind of outside of the class system, though, the Dalits. So throughout their history, the social structure has reflected kind of this Varna system. So what social structure you are in depends on where you are born. Like your family, your location, your lineage, your tribe, all that kind of stuff. It determines all of that. And you can't move, okay? You can't get more money or move into a different place or marry into a higher caste system. You are stuck in that for your entire life, and then your children are stuck in that for their entire life. Okay, and so it's not like our systems here in the United States where if you become wealthier, you kind of move up socially. it's different. Okay, it's based entirely off of how you're born and slightly based off skin color as well. So there's some skin color ethnicity to this as well. Higher castes are considered more pure. Lower castes are considered kind of dirty and damaging to a higher class. So they wouldn't even associate with one another. Okay, if you were one of the very top Brahmin, there is no way you would associate with a Dalit. In fact, it was illegal a lot of times for them to associate with one another. And of course, the outcasts, the Dalits, were the ones that would have to do the dirty work. Okay, the collecting of trash, dead bodies, fecal matter, all that kind of stuff. That was the job of the Dalits. Okay, so how does this all fit into religion? Because it's all kind of based on religion. Hinduism is a ancient language or excuse me, religion that comes to India about 1500 BC. So it comes to India thousands of years ago, and they believed in a single force in the universe called Brahman. So different than the priests. So we have the Brahmin up here, okay, the Brahmins at the very top of the pyramid. You have the Brahman is kind of this single life force in the universe. The goal of one's life should be to merge one's soul with Brahman. So kind of what you do in your life, your goal, your ultimate goal is to kind of merge your soul with this Brahman. Okay? Fun fact, yoga was developed to kind of help people achieve Brahman. Yoga was a form of meditation, and it would help you achieve Brahman. And interestingly enough, depending on what caste you were in, determined what kind of yoga you would do. And it would help you kind of achieve this Brahman in your life. The final goal was to leave Earth and join your soul with Brahman in an endless, dreamless sleep. So, a lot of Indians couldn't really comprehend this, and they needed something a little bit more realistic to achieve salvation. So, a lot of Hindu gods were created. Thousands. There are thousands of Hindu gods that are created that are studied today kind of as a means of expressing these religious feelings. So, these Hindu gods were created, and there are thousands of them in kind of the Hindu pantheon. So here's a few forms of yoga, kind of help you achieve that Brahman, help you introduce yourself to your inner soul and everything, if you ever want to take that on. Okay, so what is Hinduism? What are some of the Hindu beliefs? A major belief in Hinduism is reincarnation. This belief that the individual soul is reborn in a different form after death. So you live your life and then eventually you die, but your soul doesn't die. Your soul just gets kind of transported to a new body, and it gets reborn in a different form. And it is all determined by karma. So your actions in this life determine how the person will be reborn in the next life. So remember back to our caste system here. We have the Brahmins at the top, the Dalits at the very bottom. Your position in life was determined because of what you did in your past life. So if you were a great person and you did kind things and you contributed and you worked hard and everything, in the next life, maybe you get bumped up one of the social levels. Maybe you get to be born as a Brahmin in the next life. But maybe you were a bad person and you get born as a Dalit or something. So it kind of had a justification for the stratification of it. All the Dalits in their past life were clearly not as good people as the Brahmins. And so you would have this kind of reasoning and this justification for the treatment that a lot of these people got in their lives. So it kind of went down the order. So the Brahmins at the very top, followed by all the classes, and it even went down into the world of animals. So like at the very tippy top of the animals was the cow. Okay, cows are sacred. They were close to being humans. And then it kind of went down even. There's a stratification there of animals. So if you are just a terrible person, if you are a murderer and just a thief and all this kind of stuff, there's a chance that maybe you are born as like a cockroach in your next life. And then you better hope that, you kind of you're a good cockroach and you can kind of be born as the next animal up. And so it's a system that you had to work your way through. Okay, those in the higher caste systems are held to higher expectations. Those in the lower castes hope to move up in their next life. So they hope to kind of participate and move up in their next life. All right, let's talk about Buddha. Buddha was originally a guy named Siddhartha Gautama in 600 BC, or excuse me, 6th century BC, and he lived in northern India. Now, he's an interesting guy. He lived in the foothills of the Himalayas up in Nepal, And in his late teens, it looked like he had everything going for him. He's a good-looking guy. He had a gorgeous wife. He had a child, and he was a prince. He was entitled to a throne. But that next decade was very difficult on him. By his late 20s, he had experienced illness. His loved ones had passed away, and he had experienced all these different kind of forms of sorrow. So what he did is he gave up his throne, he abandoned his family, and he decided to spend his life finding the cure for human suffering. So his goal in life was to find this cure for human suffering, and over time he shifted his focus to long periods of meditation. So he believed that one could discover the meaning of life through meditation. So if you sit there and you meditate and you do all this meditation, you can discover the meaning of life through this. And he spent the rest of his life preaching what he had discovered. So if we're looking at Nepal, it sits right here on top of India. This is where he is from. This is where Buddha originally is from. And of course, you see Buddhist monks all the time with the shaved head, the robes. Now, there's some very key differences from Hinduism. It is kind of an offshoot of Hinduism. It started as a Hindu practice, but Hinduism was much more biased towards this class system. It was directly linked in to this class system. Whereas Gautama, he encouraged people to be responsible for their own lives. So this is a quote of his. Do not go by what is handed down, nor on the authority of your traditional teachings. When you know of yourselves these teachings are not good, then reject them. So Hinduism is all about kind of accepting your spot in life and trying to do better, whereas Buddhism is more about questioning that and kind of trying to make yourself better. Gautama, it's also interesting to note that he never claimed to be holy. He never claimed to be a god or anything like that. He just simply insisted that he is awake. So some of the principles of Buddhism. Pain, poverty, and sorrow are the result of material attachments, and one cannot achieve bodhi or wisdom until they let go of their worldly cares. Bodhi is the root word of Buddhism, so he called himself Gautama Buddha, Gautama the wise. So Buddha means the wise. And achieving wisdom is a key step in achieving nirvana. So this is term nirvana. I think we kind of like the Brahman with Hinduism, but nirvana is this ultimate reality. So you can getting wisdom and gaining wisdom is a key step in achieving this nirvana. Nirvana means the end of the self and reunion with the great world soul. So, 4 noble truths here. Ordinary life is suffering. If you are just living your life, you are suffering. This suffering is caused by our desire to satisfy ourselves. So if we are trying to seek worldly satisfaction, then that is where this suffering comes from. The way to end suffering is to end the desire for selfish goals and to see others as extensions of ourselves. So basically, be giving and be willing to accept your role kind of within the world, but also be giving to others. The way to end this desire is to follow the middle path. So the Noble Eightfold Path here. These are the 8 things you should do. Right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right concentration, and right mindfulness. If you practice all these things, you can achieve nirvana. So some more Buddhist beliefs. They also believed in reincarnation, but again, they rejected this caste system. They didn't believe that you'd be born in a higher caste. They insisted that all humans can reach nirvana as a result of their behaviors in this life. So they still believed in karma and nirvana, but it was not tied into the caste system. They also didn't believe in all the Hindu gods. They did not want their followers to and he did not want his followers to worship him after death. So if you ever see pictures of Buddha, they're always exaggerated and symbolic. This is where the idea of kind of, the round belly Buddha, the fat happy Buddha comes from, is this exaggeration of his physical shape. Today, Buddhism has around 500 million followers compared to about 1.2 million followers of Hinduism. So it is one of the major religions, and it definitely overshadows Hinduism in the world. Okay, we don't have time to talk about Sikhism and Jainism, but if you go to the PowerPoint and you can see the link here, it has more information about Jainism and Sikhism, which are also kind of offshoots of Hinduism. So that's really all I've got about China and India. I hope you enjoyed it. We'll talk a lot more about China and India, but that is where we will leave it for today.